Hello and welcome to another episode of Nkosi Sikelela with me, your host, Nkosi. And today we continue the tradition where we bring you cool subjects, cool people, and usually people with smart things to say. And a common trend in our podcast has been accumulating a lot of activists and troublemakers, and today's guest is no exception. He wasn't allowed at the US for quite some time because of some silly reason or another. But yeah, in his own right, he's also a troublemaker and an academic, and of course, the Vice-Chancellor of the University of the Witwatersrand. And before I hand over to him, just a bit of background of what we're talking about today. Today, we're talking about the recent problems that are facing our country, and namely xenophobia and gender-based violence. And I thought today would be a great day to have a conversation with Professor Habib, because he's actually been one of the few academics who've actually spoken up about these two subjects, and namely xenophobia. I think 2 weeks ago, the University of the Witwatersrand released a statement condemning the violence and also condemning the politicians or those who are at power who don't want to take any accountability and instead are perpetuating the violence and the stereotype and really the narrative that we don't want as a people. And Prof, thank you for giving us this time and welcome to the podcast.
Well, my pleasure. I'm not sure that I should be described as troublemaker, but that's okay. I'm happy to take it.
Prof, I'm quite curious on what prompted the University of the Witwatersrand, because obviously we're aware of some of the historical background that would make Wits as an institution the type of institution to always speak out against societal ills. But I'm quite interested, of course, in view of your own separate tweets and your own separate views, but what sort of compelled the university to want to take a stand?
So I think that there's two reasons why we did. The first, as you suggest, is a very practical one. And Wits University, we have something like more than 30% of our academic staff are from other parts of the world. And so we have many foreign staff. And we have about 10% of our students that are from other parts of the world. And so, in a sense, this is a very cosmopolitan community, not simply in racial terms or cultural or religious terms, but also in national terms. It's an institution where we have people from multiple nationalities. And many of those staff and students felt threatened. They felt uncomfortable. They felt that nobody was rising to their defense. They felt that voices must be heard that condemns this and actually defends their interests. So that was the first, it seems to me, practical reason why this had to happen. There's a second, more even as fundamental a reason. And that is that, and I think you implied it, the responsibility of a university is to speak out when voices need to be heard. And I know students love this, and activists love this kind of speaking truth to power. But you don't have to only speak truth to state power. Sometimes you have to speak truth to societal power. Because we might not believe it, but society has different structures of power located within it. And they need to be told. And that's often where activists find it really difficult, where institutions find it really, really difficult. But unless you can stand up and say that this is unacceptable, the murder of people on the basis of their nationality is unacceptable, and that frankly we need as a society to stand up against it. And so for both those reasons, we needed to be speaking as a society to say this is wrong, this is morally wrong, it's empirically incorrect. And then secondly, to at least articulate to both our staff, our foreign staff and our foreign students, that we have your back, that we're in your corner, and that we will not allow you to be hurt, not on this campus.
And I think what is quite interesting is also how the conversation about migration or illegal immigration stems from, I think, few facts that also are a bit troubling when the Alexandra protests happened and the political voice came out and said, really nothing will be done unless Home Affairs comes and verifies everyone that lives in Alexandra, where the sort of what clashes between foreign shop owners in the Johannesburg CBD and the police. And the sort of response that we had from politicians was somewhat of a clampdown to say, this is what is an attack on South African sovereignty, is an attack on our police. And when now the violence escalated, it's as if there was a difference in terms of the willfulness from politicians to say something or react as strong as they did initially.
So I think that there's three very separate issues that one needs to discuss around xenophobia and, if you like, immigration and the role of immigration in a society. The first assumption that is made by mobs, sometimes politicians, and many people in civil society is that immigrants are a drain on the national purse. And that's just not true. Every single research done shows that collectively immigrants give you more in the society than they take out of the society. So everybody focuses on the individual Nigerian child or Ghanaian child or child from Lesotho that goes to a school and it costs. But what they don't factor into account is the fact that that child's parent may actually open up a business, and that business sells and increases the GDP, and that it has a positive effect on society. So I want to be clear, because I don't think we're sufficiently clear on this when we articulate it, that collectively immigrants give more to South African society than they cost to South African society. So there's a net gain. If they all leave tomorrow, we will lose out. And that's something that is important to articulate. The second thing, there is no doubt that there's a racial dynamic in the xenophobia.
Yeah.
So I'm not suggesting that we should start attacking white foreigners, but I do think that the real victims of xenophobic attacks are not skilled migrants from Germany or the UK or the United States, but it's the poorest of the migrants from neighboring countries. And frankly, I think that that's a problem. I think there's a class dynamic, and I think there's a racial dynamic. And for all of our claim to be a non-racial society and to be a pan-Africanism, including all of it, we actually violate the very people that we claim are allies and brothers and sisters. So that's the second challenge around that. The third, what I worry about politicians, and I'm not talking about from the ANC or from the EFF, I'm talking about all of them. They qualify. So they say, we think this is wrong, but you must act according to the rules. Now, by qualifying, what you're saying is not wrong. But when you qualify that statement at a particular historical moment, it gets read as, actually, we don't think it's all too bad. And that's unacceptable. There are too many politicians that are walking around saying that actually we're not xenophobic. Actually, let's be honest, we are as a society. And let's deal with the problem. People are saying I heard a politician say yesterday, actually, we're not xenophobic. Yes, there's been violence, but you guys, we can't deal with Africa's problems. You bloody leaders in the rest of the continent must get your act together. Now, what he or she is absolutely correct in is those leaders do need to get their act in. But when you say it in this historical moment, you're trying to say, I can understand why there's xenophobic attacks. And that's an unacceptable message. We should say it's unacceptable that anybody should be attacked. It is unacceptable that men and women are being killed. And frankly, if you kill somebody in our society, we're going to take you and lock you up. Now, that I think has to be a message that's not contestable. Then, when the dust settles, I think we have to say, how do we deal with the structural issues? How do we make sure that other political leaders play their role in their societies? I think that's all that. But context is important. Historical moment is important. And for me, there's too much of qualification. Instead of you condemn with one hand, and then you kind of create the impression that I understand. The understanding is not acceptable. Not at this historical moment. And so in a sense, it seems to me that that's the second thing that we need to do. And then it seems to me we need political leadership, right? How do you stop what is becoming a very violent society? Not only amongst people who are foreigners, but particularly against women and children. Femicide is an outrageous phenomenon in our society. The statistics are completely unacceptable. They're out of line with any place, or many places, most places in the world. We've got a problem. And part of this, it seems to me, is a problem within ourselves. Here's the problem. Everybody sees violence as the problem perpetrated elsewhere. Yeah. They don't say their own role in contributing to the violence. So here's where I'm going to say some difficult things. Look at every union strike. There's many union strikes by progressives who land up in violence. Now they argue that our struggle is legitimate. Yeah. And therefore we can have violence and therefore we can kill people. I'm sorry, that's just unacceptable. Because you're consolidating the very violence in your society. We are seeing femicide, we are seeing gender-based harm amongst political parties that claim to be progressive, that claim to be committed to socially inclusive societies. We're seeing that, and not one party, across all of the parties. We're seeing social struggles. How many community struggles? Actually, where you see a burning, where you see this thing. Now, the very people are saying, we don't like this violence, we want you to protect us against this violence, and then they engage in it. I've been critical, if you like, in my book around student violence. Yesterday, fascinating to watch, yesterday or the day before, at the University of Zululand, one of the campuses. The students are protesting that the campus is not safe, and we want a violent-free campus. Perfectly legitimate. What are they doing? They're stoning cars on the N2. So you're committing violence in the struggle for having a safe space. But what you're doing in that act is you're contributing to a culture of violence. Yeah. So I do think that there's an internal question that we all have to ask. What are we doing? What is our response? Are we engaging in a legitimate? So that's, it seems to be the first. I don't think we're going to deal with the violence so long as policing is not appropriate and so long as prosecutions is not appropriate. Frankly, our police are not sufficiently trained. We know this. We know this across the board. We know that when they engage in dealing with protests, they themselves can be violent. And we know that even when they arrest people, people are out within a couple of days. And so, in a sense, we've got a problem in policing about how you police without violence. And then when you arrest people, how do you actually ensure that prosecution happens? So there's a real problem on policing and prosecution. And then it seems to me that we got, as you suggest, governance right. So if our borders are porous, if we don't have appropriately trained people on our borders, if Home Affairs, or at least some officials in Home Affairs are corrupt, you don't blame the illegal immigrants, you blame the incapacities of our system. That's the problem. And we need to have the courage to recognize the challenge. Don't deflect the problem to somebody else. We collectively have to now say, what is our own complicity in the very violence that we create in our society? You know, on gender-based harm, most deaths happen. The people who kill you are the people who are closest to you. That's the problem. It suggests there's something really seriously wrong in our society and in our family structures, in our social structures. When the people, it's not the people who you don't know. It's not the gangster. We have to deal with that. But the people who are killing in our society is not the gangster. It's not the other. It's your loved ones in a particular moment. Yeah. And that suggests that we've got a problem. And we've got to confront it, we've got to recognize it and deal with it. And it seems to me that we collectively need to deal with this. So I worry about where we are at in this historical moment. And I don't think we're going to actually get out of this moment until the political elite, until the president, until the political leadership stand up and collectively say, this is our problem, this is what we've got to do, here are our challenges and we've got to deal with this. Otherwise, we're going to be playing around in circles.
And I think it's interesting that you touch on law enforcement and policing and how it's structured in South Africa, where the very fact that people can gather as a group and commit heinous crimes is perhaps an example of how even law enforcement and the responsibility thereof is deferred to communities. And as such, communities are able to then organize themselves, even for wrong things.
So that's right. So here's the thing that struck me about the videos around when this current wave of immigrant xenophobic attacks happened. There was a video, and I can't recall which area it was, where there was a shop that was being looted. The police were standing right there. Yeah. So it wasn't like they were trying to stop anybody. They were kind of having a conversation like you and I had, and people are running in, taking the stuff and walking out. There are people punching each other, and the police are there. Now, when you see that, do you have faith in the police as an institution that is meant to protect you in society? So that's the first huge problem. I saw yesterday, and I can't remember again which township it was, in Northwest, where councillors' houses, 8 councillors' houses were burnt. And people have just heart fall. And so in a sense, and you're seeing this in place after place after place, where effectively people take the law into their own hands, they catch somebody. And I listened to the guy whose brother was killed. And tell me this is what they do. This guy apparently was accused of stealing a television. No case opened up. The community takes the law into its own hands, partly because they've lost faith in the police and prosecution services, etc. So what do? They take the guy, they beat him up. The brother runs out at 2 o'clock. He sees his brother being in. Then they take a tire, put it around his neck, and they necklace him. Now, firstly, there's 3 things. Firstly, we don't know whether this person was guilty or not. It's done on an assumption of guilt. And we've got to ask that question. The second, even if he is guilty, he stole a television. We collectively killed the guy by burning him alive. Is this legitimate? Is that a proportional sentence for the crime that was committed? And third, ask yourself, the people who burnt him alive and the children who may have seen that, what is their sense of humanity after that heinous crime itself? Are you then surprised that they then kill loved ones? They murder and beat up loved ones after what they've done to a stranger themselves. That is what we've got to start asking as a society. Look, we have trauma. There's no doubt about it. Part of that trauma comes from history. Part of it comes from the very roots of apartheid, the segregation, lumping people in reserves, having them live lives on the very margins of human existence. But part of that trauma is being consolidated in post-apartheid South Africa. And yes, there are structural inequalities. I have this in the book again. When I was in the midst of Fees Must Fall, there was a huge argument that was made by activists that there are structural inequalities, there's structural violence in our society. That the fact that somebody is not having food on the table or their children cannot walk, there's a structural violence committed against them because of the very nature of inequality. And there's no doubt that that exists. But what the real danger is you can't justify from structural violence the right for individual acts of violence from one to another. And I made this point. You can't say that we grow up in a patriarchal society and therefore black men, because of the inequality in our society, are subjected to much higher levels of, if you like, poverty and unemployment and inequality. And we know that as a result, in part of that, there is, if you like, a crisis of masculinity amongst young men in our society. Not black men, all men. They have no idea. Their view of what it means to be masculine is emaciated in many ways. And there's a crisis of masculinity. You can't, from the basis of that, say, therefore it's legitimate for a black man to rape a black woman or a white woman or whatever. It's just, you can't extrapolate from the structure. You can explain maybe, but it can never be used as justification. And so I worry about a logic. I think we're going to have to deal with this. And it's really challenges, and we're going to have to confront them really boldly and openly. And it seems to me that that's something that we have to do.
And in a way, Prof, do you think the conversation that we're having specifically about xenophobia and how no one wants to take ownership or accountability over this, that it's somewhat furthering electionability and the message going to further, to another, another period of elections in that? And I think the ANC did badly here, where it was never the ANC's language to speak on immigration or even speak badly of immigration. And you have a mayor in Johannesburg that has said in no uncertain terms that I'm an anti-illegal immigration candidate, vying for a second term, of course. But then I think what Herman Mashaba has been able to do in getting the ANC to speak a similar language to him is to show that the ANC actually does not itself have any plan regarding immigration, and that the ANC now got baited into acting and proving Herman Mashaba's point that if you give me more police, if you paid more attention to A, B, and C, we wouldn't be here. And I think the ANC tactically showed itself inflexible and close to clueless.
So I think there was a political failure on multiple parts. I mean, I think, firstly, let's be honest. So there's this argument that is being made about legal immigration and illegal immigration. And so let's even talk about legal immigration. Go ask any student in any university who's foreign how easy government has made it for them to get their visa and renewable. This is supposed to be legal. This is somebody who is legitimately in this place to study. And go ask them how much of a difficult relationship they have with government officials, government relationships. And I can give you 1,000 examples of this across the board. So we claim we open to legal immigration, but actually we find it really difficult, and we have a real difficult manner of dealing with it. And part of this might just be incompetence, but actually part of it is really problematic. So that's the first part of it. Then in your argument and your criticism of illegal immigration, you have kind of articulated it in a manner, and the politicians have suggested and recommended or implied action that actually borders on the unethical and frankly sometimes borders on the illegal. They kind of imply, when the violence gets out of hand, they said, no, we never meant that. But they take the conversation to the very point which implies that this is not, that encourages this kind of thing. So for me, that's the thing. I think you're absolutely right. I think the ANC got caught flat-footed. This thing went wild. They had no idea how to respond. They responded to try and get people. The policing services wasn't appropriate. They then effectively acted. Then they started getting heat from other countries, and now they're sending envoys to other countries to say, please, that's not, and now they're saying, but we're not xenophobic. Actually, we've had repeated attacks on foreign immigrants in the last 15 years, repeatedly. We are xenophobic, admit that, and then say, how do we fix this? And yes, economic distress enables this kind of behavior, but it's not a justification of this kind of behavior. And our problem is we move from explanation to making it an excuse. Yes, many leaders on this continent should get their act together. But to be honest, that's not an excuse for us to kill people in the streets of Johannesburg or in the streets of Alexandria or any other place. Just unacceptable. And I think we need to be clear on that. And there's too much wavering. There's too much qualification. And frankly, that is the really difficult thing that I find in this context.
And if now I'm trying to connect this conversation to another conversation about gender-based violence, and I think how they intersect these issues is how, in light of what happened in the country over the last few weeks, the tragic death of a UCT student, Uyinen, and how we never as a community stood up, and maybe it's because these issues were happening at the same time, but you never felt, and even Uyinen is not the first case of gender-based violence. Every day there are women in numbers that are dying, but the communities don't seem particularly interested in those situations. And the funny thing is that you could even have rapists who want to be law on to immigrants. Is it maybe because there isn't any political facilitation towards the point of having an honest conversation with gender-based violence, or is it just communities don't care?
Well, I think that, I think that firstly we've got a problem, and I think you're right. I think we're not having a political leadership on this matter. Look, I think Nene's murder has shaken up the society in quite a dramatic way because of the outrageousness of it, right? Yeah, is somebody going to a post office to actually collect a parcel, and for you to be subjected in the simple act of walking into a post office to the kinds of violence and death that she was subjected to has angered people. And it's angered people across the board. And so I think that, and so for instance, what you've suddenly seen is the marches on Parliament, the fact that the President has called for a parliamentary conversation on the matter, the fact that universities around the country have marched, and a whole range of them. So I think firstly, there is that. And you're right, Nene wasn't the first, and it's sad to say will not be the last. That's the tragedy of our society. And frankly, we've got to get our act together on this. And it's only going to happen in part through political leadership. But I do think that there are some hard questions that if you ask me, what is required to fix this? I'm not an expert, but I will say to you there's three elements that I think have to be there. First, structural constraints and structural inequalities are no excuse for gender-based harm. It's just unacceptable. And so in a sense, the first thing that I would do if I was in a position to act is to get policing and prosecutions right. Simple matter. There should be, if there's a rape, if there's gender-based harm, it must be investigated. The person must be suspended and acted. If they found guilty, they must be prosecuted, and there must be consequences. If that doesn't happen, nobody feels that there's consequences for the violence themselves. It's non-negotiable. Now, if that means we have to send our guys and we need detectives to train our policemen, then so be it. If we have to go to Germany, or we have to bring people from Germany or the United States, or bring people to train our people to get the first basic thing, that it seems to me. We've got to get policing right, and we've got to get prosecutions right. Second, a security response can never permanently resolve the gender-based harm. It gives you some breathing space, but that's all it gives you. Then you have to deal with the real structural inequalities in our society. And the structural inequalities are deep. 50% of our society earn less than 2% a day. The last 10 years, we've lost ground in inclusion. Something like 55% of young people are unemployed. Frankly, you go to some townships, the number is close to 85% of young people. Now, you can't ask somebody to live and think about inclusion when you're operating on the very, very edges of society itself. And by the way, this is about gender-based harm. It's how you explain the issues of why young people join gangs in poor areas or in the Western Cape. Part of this is the very deep inequalities in our society. And frankly, you can't resolve inequality unless you get growth. Inequality doesn't automatically get resolved by growth, but it's a precondition. You can't, because otherwise you're going to equalize poverty rather than growth. So you have to get this right. And then third, irrespective of that, we need a conversation in our society amongst men about what it means to be a man. And frankly, there's too many even politicians, who have this misogynistic machoism that to be a man means you need to sleep with 10 women or 20 women, that to be a man you need to clap somebody. frankly, that reflects weakness, not strength. I put it, men need to get their shit together. Whatever the inequality, whatever the policing, you get your shit together. You don't use structural inequality as an excuse. Structural inequality as an excuse to weaponize against women or children. It's just unacceptable. So it seems to me we have to deal at all of the three levels. Now, in the university, what do you do? And it seems to me at a particular university, here's a simple thing, and we're talking about this. When somebody is found guilty as a staff member or as a student, how is it they get expelled or fired from one place and land up at an institution in another place? That's just completely unacceptable. Now the question is, part of our rules create a problem, because part of our rules say you're not allowed to declare this. That if you found guilty and you're a staff member, if I, as a university, inform another one, I can be sued. Now, we have to change that law. We have to change those rules, because rules are meant to enable outcomes. But there are things we could do. So the question is, what are those issues? Some of which we have done at Wits. So we've created a gender equity office. We've created at Wits, there was a problem when we had sexual harassment cases. The man and the woman, or the perpetrator and the victim, would be put in the same room and cross-examined. It means that the victim goes through the trauma again. We've now separated that. But clearly, that's not good enough. There's more that has to be done. So I think universities need to act. I think corporate institutions need to act. I think government needs to act. And I think all of this is only going to be facilitated by political leadership. And that's absolutely necessary in this kind of context.
And then with respect to being in academic institutions, and you've just outlined now how difficult it is to implement some of the solutions that are coming from a national perspective. But if we look at Twitter and we look at society of young people who engage and you have conversations with them, and there seems to be a problem with even, and I know that Wits has come under scrutiny for this, for the culture of institution, the culture of male residences. I think when I was a student in my first year here, and we were going induction, but I hear a lot has changed. But you could hear in some of the songs that we sang there, you could see how the relatability between male residences and female residences in somewhat in a perspective that female residences have to be in some servitude to the male residences. And what do you think is Wits's, or what has been Wits's and your personal approach to actually remove some of what we have thought was always normal in that context?
So I think that there's two questions. I think there's absolutely right. There's a whole series of cultural practices at Wits and in many universities that, if you like, consolidate this patriarchal and frankly attitude that enables gender-based harm. So the fact that you would walk in at men's res particularly, there was a whole series, but no Kando and others, there's a whole series of cultural initiation practices that belittled younger people, that suggested to younger men that if you want to be seen as a man, you need to bring women's underwear back to the residences. This kind of nonsense that circulates. Now, to be honest, we've been acting against it consistently over the last 2 to 3 to 4 years. So for now, for instance, in orientation, we have programs on gender-based harm, on how you relate to women, on how you relate to each other. We have initiation practices where people are violent. You actually are suspended People have been removed from residences in this regard. So there's been both consequences and actions. Has this completely eroded the culture? No. The fact is, implicitly men's race think that they're kind of cool because their notions of masculinity are fairly kind of machoist and toxic, and it has to be dealt with. And we are dealing with this. But dealing with the culture, by the way, takes time. It takes processes. It takes multiple years. Well, we've been dealing with gender-based harm actually long before I came, but from when I came, every single year, and every time we make some gains, new problems emerge, and we do this. This is not a project. It's going to be a process over multiple years to actually rid our society. And frankly, we have to get our act together at Wits. But Wits is never going to be an island in a toxic society. It will cross the boundaries. And so we've got to act collectively. And for me, I think that have we done enough? No. Do we need to do more? Absolutely. But I also think that we need to act firmly, and we all need to play our leadership role, and it has to start from the apex of society. I will say two other things which I think are important. Is what is legitimate political action is important. So let me give you an example. One of the things that came out from Yusuf's statement when the explosion happened around Nene's murder is we released a statement saying that gender-based harm is unacceptable, that we need to take a firm response to it, and we need to get our act together. But there was also naming and shaming. Now, in the context of naming and shaming, I do think there's a real question to be had. If somebody is found guilty and they've committed rape, I think there has to be action. And more importantly, I'm open to the idea of naming and shaming. Because actually, I think our laws and our policies must enable that. Because it's unacceptable that somebody appears in another institution through a different format. But naming and shaming somebody without a case being filed runs the risk of exactly the kinds of the mob logic that emerged in the xenophobic violence. And that's something that we've got to be careful of. And so in a sense, what are the parameters of what is acceptable protest? What is acceptable actions? So there is one case that I know of, where, here's the thing. Somebody went on Twitter and identified another member for having committed or being complicit in an agenda of gender-based harm. The person who got accused was another woman. And the argument was, I raised it, and the person didn't provide me support. We investigated this case. And it turned out that actually, in this case, not in all, but in this case, somebody was using the moment to target somebody else that they had a difference of opinion with. Now, we were able to consolidate it and it didn't get out of hand. But imagine if somebody walked and attacked that person and hurt that person on the basis because somebody put something in social media. So I do think we have to ask what are the legitimate parameters of acceptable protest. I'll give you another example. And again, people are going to criticize me for my... I don't believe closing and shutting down campuses is the answer to this. I think you're going to create... There's no logical... That's not a logical response to this. I can imagine you coming and saying, we want to collectively as a university community come together to have a symbolic... But shutting down this universities permanently for the rest of the year does not make logical sense. It's not going to enhance the agenda for gender-based violence. So the question then becomes, at the moment there's a logic that has emerged amongst student activists at universities that whatever the issue, The answer is shut down the issue. I would imagine it would be far more powerful to say we're calling out the VCs to come and sit with us. I'm just using this as an example. I'm sure the VCs will not like this, but anyway. To come and sit with us in the union buildings until we see action. It's a far more powerful statement than shutting down. Because when you shut down, you split the university campus. You split the understanding of the consequences. And the trick about struggle, by the way, which comes from our own this thing, is to unite the forces of progress and divide the forces who are opposed to you. You actually, by resorting to campus shutdown at every single moment, you are destroying the very basis. You're also creating, I might add, an instability in our education system that is actually getting out of hand. I mean, at the moment we've got about 5 or 6 places that are shut down at various moments. The people who suffer most, by the way, is the poorest. Because the real places where the shutdowns happen is Zululand, or Walter Sisulu, or Venda, or where institutions where the poorest of our people are. And so that's the kind of consequence that is playing out. We're going to have a serious conversation about what is acceptable tactics and strategies. There was a big grumble about whether people should have marched in Sandton. I'm less worried about Sandton. Sandton is rich enough to mark a plan. They'll get over their problem. It was a bit of inconvenient for a couple of people to walk around Sandton. But I do think that there has to be a serious debate amongst the activist movements. I mean, I'm not talking about students alone now. I'm talking about students, community organizations, unions, about legitimate parameters of social struggle. And I do think all of these things are questions to be asked. I do think there's much we can do. Yeah. The listing of, a simple rule change would create the possibility that anybody who's convicted of actually rape or gender-based harm should not be able to appear in another institution. That's a simple reaction. If we get, for instance, I think, conversations between men on campus, and my having conversations with men and saying, hey, you know what, we have to get our shit together. This kind of behavior is unacceptable. It's simple kinds of things, in those simple kinds of ways, I think can change the culture of the place. It can put people on the defensive. And there was a time, I'll just say this, in the 80s, you'd walk into a place and people would say, we use words like kafa or kuli, and there would be no repercussion. Today, in most normal places, nobody would dare say that. Culture changed because of what is acceptable leadership. Similarly, why is it acceptable to say, hey, I'm a cool guy, I see the underwear that I have from the woman that I slept with, yes, that is unacceptable. It should not be seen as a badge of honor, it should be seen as a sign of shame. Yeah. And that requires cultural shifts. And that requires action from all of us.
And Prof, thank you so much for indulging us. And I think if I say anything else, it would ruin really the powerful contribution you've had to this conversation today. And to you, our listeners, we're coming to you from the University of the Witwatersrand. There's a nice view here that only myself, the Prof, and the production guys are enjoying. And just like that, we conclude today's episode. This was episode 10. To follow us, follow me at Kinguli on Instagram and on Twitter. To follow the Vice-Chancellor, Professor Habib. Is it still the...
It's ADHAB. I think it's ADHABB.
Yeah. I think there's another famous Adam Habib.
Is there? Yeah. There's one who's a kind of historian from some part of the world or something like that.
Yeah. I just like that. We're out of here, man.